So welcome, and thanks for coming. This is a physics colloquium,
Some misunderstanding here.
but we aren't going to hear about the typical things you hear in a physics colloquium about truth and beauty. We're going to hear about the truth. Gareth Cook is here today to talk about stem cells and the truth, ethics, fraud, and politics in science. This is something he's written a lot about over the last year or more, and the rest of the physics department is now coming in. And he got the Pulitzer Prize last year for this. This was quite a actually nice series of articles. I enjoyed reading them. Of course, lately there's been some interesting story about stem cell research in Korea, and he's also written some very nice pieces on that, and I think you're going to hear some linear combination of both of those. Since I'm up here and I had a chance to think about this a little bit, I have a little bit of an introduction, a little bit of a story, which won't go for too long because you really want to hear him. But I was thinking about the title of this. I was thinking about an alternative title for this, which is called Lies and the Lying Liars Who Tell Them. But as you know, Al Franken got a hold of that one first, and that was mostly focused on politicians. And sort of growing up in the 60s, we always thought politicians were the ones who lied, but not people in science. Today we have what I would call a pandemic of lies. We have the Oprah Book Club scandal, Mr. Fry and his million little pieces. We have journalists like Jason Blair, right, who made up characters and plagiarized. Of course, plagiarizing means you're using somebody else's lies. But even the physicists have known sin. As Oppenheimer once said, we had Heinrich Schoen, who was making up stories and painting pictures and using them over and over again in his career. Of course, it cost him his career. He lost his PhD. But there is perhaps a silver lining for him. I hear he's going to get a book deal. Title of the book, I think, is going to be A Million Little Lies. And I hear Oprah might actually take that into her club as well. So with that story of lies and the lying liars who tell them, we have somebody of great dignity and all that other stuff. He doesn't like to lie. He likes to tell the truth. And in some sense, the reason he is here is actually because of something that happened a few years ago. He came to a conference with us in Snowmass, and after the conference, we bought him a dinner, and he was going to pay because he's not allowed to accept things from places, especially institutions that are trying to get his favor. So he said, well, okay, let's have a lunch together. So for the last 3 years, we've been trying to get a lunch together. And then when I heard he won the Pulitzer Prize, I told him, here, you can pay off the lunch, come and give this talk. And so with that, we have today Gareth Cook. Oh, well. Who was that guy? And that was a lie. I was just checking. Right. Sound check there. Gareth's been with the Boston Globe for about 5 years now. He writes on science. He's actually one of my favorite science writers. He's always got a little twist in there. And the format for this is a bit unusual, again, because it's not your typical physics colloquium. He's going to talk for about a half hour. I don't think he has a single slide or PowerPoint or anything like that to present. And then when he gets finished, there's going to be a question and answer, and it looks like there might be a few questions and hopefully some answers. And we've asked our new academic vice president, who is an MD and PhD in biology, to moderate that. He'd be the perfect person, I think, for that. Of course, this could become a very heated subject, more so than I think than typical physics colloquia are. And so that's why we asked him, because I think he can actually handle the crowd and handle the questions along with Gareth. And with that long and winded introduction, I give you Gareth Cook.
Thank you.
Thanks, Evan.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you. So I'd like to talk today, as Kevin suggested, about the relationship between science and the truth, which is a very big topic. I'm going to make it a lot smaller by really talking just about my own experiences with reporting on stem cell research, because I think it actually illuminates a lot of these issues. And I'm going to focus, I guess, on the negative here, which is we're going to focus on how science is not about the truth. We sort of all know about this caricature in the public mind of the scientist who goes out and discovers something true about the world and announces it to the world, and those are the facts. You have it with Galileo or Newton. They make this discovery. It's amazing. They've seen the world as it truly is, and they share it with the rest of the world. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how that's not true. And before I do that, though, I need to sort of give a very important caveat, which is that I'm not a scientist. I'm a journalist. There's a lot of people in this room who know a lot more about science than I ever will. So this is really an outsider's perspective on science and how it works and how it sort of gets tangled up. And I also think it's important that this not be a speech. I mean, when I'm done talking, I'd really like to have questions, because I think a lot of good things come out in questions and answers. That's actually my business. That's how I earn my living, is asking people questions. So it's sort of uncomfortable in a way for me to be up here talking. I'm usually the one asking the questions. So I really hope that you will ask questions at the end. I can date my first interest in stem cell research very precisely. Kevin, you'd be happy about that. February 2004. There was this paper that came out, which was unbelievable. It turns out it actually is unbelievable, but this team in South Korea had managed to create cloned embryonic stem cells. And this was a major step forward in biology, and was going to make possible all sorts of new kinds of research. It also attracted my eye for the first time just to the area of stem cells. The way newspapers work, you have reporters who sort of cover wide areas of things. In my case, I cover science, which means astronomy, physics, archaeology, chemistry. It can mean anything, really. So I hadn't really been paying attention to stem cell research. And this paper came out, and it seemed so interesting that I said to myself, what's going on with this, basically? Why don't I look into this and sort of see what's going on with stem cells around here? This is before it really had become a huge political issue. It had been sort of, I think, a sort of low-level debate at that point, but it hadn't really hit the headlines, and that wasn't, I wasn't even aware of that at the time. I was mostly just interested in finding out about what was happening in this area of biology, and I felt like I was just behind the curve, because here are all these papers coming out, and I didn't even know what a stem cell was. So that's sort of how I first got interested in the topic. I'm going to have to do a very quick aside here to just sort of explain a few basic terms, and I'll try to make this very quick. And if anyone's a biologist in this room, please don't correct me. So what is a stem cell? Very basically, a stem cell is a cell that can replicate itself, and it can also turn into other more specialized cells. So if you think about this, this is something that could be very useful if you could use this ability. For example, when you cut your finger, magically, it heals itself. All the different types of skin cells have been replaced in just the right way. This is sort of done through stem cells. So people are interested in stem cells because if you can use this ability to expand the population of cells and turn into just the right kind of cells, you can heal all sorts of things. Now, there's also two broad types of stem cells, which are called, rather confusingly, adult stem cells and embryonic stem cells. Embryonic stem cells are cells which are taken from human embryos. So these are about 5 or 6 days old. They're sort of microscopic. They look like a ball of maybe 200 cells. This is how we all started life. And they have the ability, unlike other types of stem cells, to turn into any type of cell in the body. So other types of stem cells, these adult stem cells, can only become particular types of stem cells. And now we're almost done with the primer. Cloned embryonic stem cells is what the South Koreans had done, or as it turns out, not done. And in this case, they're able to create embryonic stem cells, but with the exact DNA of a particular person. So let's say you have a disease using this, that you need some tissue replaced. In theory, you could create embryonic stem cells with your precise DNA and then grow the tissue that you need and then give it to you to cure your disease. So that's what the South Koreans had claimed to have done, which is to create these first embryonic stem cells that were precisely matched to someone's DNA. So this is all very interesting, but I want to share with you the story that really got me fascinated by this and really convinced me that there was something to do here. And that is, I was talking to this family, in particular this woman, Marie Dooley, who lives in Weymouth, Massachusetts. And she had 2 children through IVF, so she'd been through this long process of fertility treatment. The kids were growing up. I think they were maybe 4 and 6 at the time I did the story. And she told me about one day going out to the front steps, opening up the mailbox, and there's a letter from Boston IVF, which is where she'd had her fertility treatment. She was sort of taken aback at even seeing this letter because she'd kind of put those days behind her, and she couldn't imagine why they were writing to her. So she opens up the letter, and it says essentially, "Dear Ms. Dooley, we still have frozen embryos in storage. The insurance isn't going to pay for it anymore. What do you want us to do with them?" So all of a sudden, this woman found herself right in the middle of this whole debate. She had to sort of, and she's Catholic, which I think is important to the story because she felt particularly conflicted about this. She had to decide, what were these embryos? What is their moral status? Now you hear in the newspaper, and I'd been hearing sort of about this moral debate over embryonic stem cells. And the way it's typically heard is you have 2 sides. One side says, well, these are just balls of cells, These are not human lives. So, and this research has great potential. So we don't see what the fuss is about. Let's move on with it. And then you have the other side, which says, this is a human life. And there is nothing worth destroying a human life, no matter how promising this research is. And here's Marie Dooley, who hears both of these things. But she's not making a political decision. She's not making a policy decision. She's making a very personal, practical decision about what to do. This is what really interested me about this. Because she was trying to decide the answer to this question for herself on a human level. And talking to her made it clear to me that at least from her perspective, both of these positions that I've laid out are kind of ridiculous. And this is why she had so much trouble. Let me sort of try to explain it to how she explained it to me. So she said, well, first of all, take this, the advocates of this research. They have this position, well, these are just balls of cells. She had been through fertility treatment, and she had 2 children. These 2 children, the most cherished things in her life, started out as these things that are being called just a ball of cells. So that doesn't seem right to her. It didn't sit right with her. On the other hand, having been through fertility treatment and having gone through cycle after cycle of putting these embryos into her and trying to conceive a child, trying to have a child, she knew, I think better than just about anyone can know, the difference between these embryos sitting in a freezer and the children that were walking around her house. So I wrote a story about her decision. And in doing this story, I realized how much journalists were failing and how much I think our country was failing in discussing this issue. Because it was this is a very sort of serious and complicated issue, and it was being resolved like a boxing match. So in a way, her story is unsatisfying because I don't have an answer to this moral question. I don't know what the answer to this moral question is. But what I think this story showed me and what I tried to show readers is that it's a lot more complicated than really you've heard. And that is what got me interested. That's what got me interested in pursuing stem cell research as a topic. And that became the first of a series of stories that I did that ended up winning the Pulitzer Prize. So after doing this story, I talked to my editors, and it sort of became clear that this topic was exactly the kind of topic that needed some kind of attempt at fair explanation. And I sort of want to take you back to 2004 and explain why that is. First of all, it's important. You have fundamental ethical issues about the beginning of life, how we treat our elderly, the future of medical research, how science is controlled, how it should be controlled. At the same time, it's really confusing. I read the newspapers fairly regularly, and before I started looking into this topic, I didn't understand it at all. And so you have this issue which is important and but confusing, and even confusing to scientists. Even today, if you were to ask stem cell biologists to give a precise definition of what a stem cell is, I think they would disagree. They would probably agree in general terms, but they would disagree. And if you were to ask them, well, what areas of stem cell research are the most promising or the most interesting? Where should we be spending our money? They would disagree about that. So that made it even more complicated. At the same time, the research was moving very quickly, so the landscape was constantly shifting. And then on top of this, you had well-funded campaigns, both for and against the research. And these campaigns were systematically misleading the public. And they did this typically through a technique which I think is probably the most effective propaganda, which is lying through the truth. What I mean by that is they would present a set of facts, all of which are true, but which are profoundly misleading. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Let's see, how much time have I taken here? Let me tell you, I do want to tell you quickly one sort of side story, and that is to give you a sense for why this debate matters and why all this sort of hype around this debate is important. I did a story about a kid in Massachusetts whose family was taking him to Kiev to receive embryonic stem cell treatment. So his parents had been listening to the debate about this, and they were very excited about all the things that embryonic stem cell research could do. So they flew him to this clinic in Kiev, which claimed to be giving embryonic stem cells, and at a cost of, I think $10,000 a treatment, something like that. So they'd mortgaged their home, the school held a bake sale. And this kid has muscular dystrophy. So this family's in the situation of they have this kid who's literally falling apart in front of their eyes. There's no treatment, really. And they'd been hearing about the promise of embryonic stem cell treatment. So I went to Kiev, and to make a long story short, I ended up writing this long story about all these clinics that were popping up around the world, offering embryonic stem cell treatments, or just stem cell treatments, basically as a new cure-all. And I think that story, I hope, sort of underlined the danger of this sort of inflated rhetoric that we have around this topic. Another area that we saw is you heard a lot about adult stem cells. So there are opponents of this research, of embryonic stem cell research who took the tact of saying, well, it's unethical, but also here's this other area of research, adult stem cell research. And these adult stem cells are just as good. You can do all the same things with as you can with embryonic stem cells, except we don't need to destroy embryos. That's what they were saying. It turns out that that's just not really true. It might be true. It might be true in 10 years. It might turn out to be true, but it's not true now. But this was the sort of one of the central arguments that opponents were making about this research. And I went out to Minnesota to visit a woman. Her name is Catherine Verfai. She's sort of a leading stem cell biologist who was doing work in adult stem cells. And she'd done some of the most important work that showed that this might someday be a possibility. That in other words, you could take blood cells and use them to cure the brain, cure the spinal cord. And she was horrified at what had been done with her research. So, she turns on the television and hears politicians who are opposed to embryonic stem cell research touting her research and using this as the example, the reason why embryonic stem cell research shouldn't go on. And then you have people who want embryonic stem cell research to go on. You have them sort of not wanting to admit that adult stem cells have promise. And it sort of goes back and forth, and before you know it, it's sort of impossible to have a reasoned discussion about this. And it's definitely the case that scientific journals, which in theory are supposed to just pick the most promising research, picked papers to help make their point. And typically that point was that embryonic stem cell research should go on. And so when people came out with papers that refuted adult stem cell research, they would be eager to publish them. The other way you sort of see this playing out is just in the way people talk about research, just the words that they use. So politicians, people who are opponents of embryonic stem cell research, like to say the word embryo. When Romney was campaigning against this research, he would say embryo, embryo, embryo. You have to destroy embryos to do this research. You're killing embryos. This is, of course, true. But the thing that's misleading about that is that when you say embryo, I think the typical person, I know this is true of me, pictures a little tiny baby with tiny hands and feet, screaming as he's, ripped apart. And that's really misleading. Now, people can disagree about where precisely life begins, or if you can even pick a point at which life begins. But I think it's misleading to give people this image of what's happening that's not true. And you see the same thing around the word cloning, which is that opponents of this research say the word clone, clone, clone over and over again because it's disturbing. You sort of picture these, Matrix or, baby farms where people are sort of being grown for their organs, when that's just not what's happening. So that was another story I did. In the end, of course, this whole story has a strange twist, which is that the thing that got me interested in this field in the first place turned out to be complete fiction. This paper and another follow-up paper by the South Korean team was a complete fraud. It was invented. And to me, there were a lot of questions about, well, what does this mean for stem cell research? What's going to happen next? One of the interesting things is, well, I think there's two teams actually, well, three teams in Massachusetts that are all interested in doing exactly what the South Koreans claim to have done. So I think that we're going to see in this country in a few years, we're going to have another very intense debate, which will probably be even more confusing about cloning. But to me, the thing that was most interesting is how scientists talked about fraud. So you have this high-profile case in which these scientists perpetrated this amazing fraud on the world. And as Kevin alluded to, there's a number of other cases. MIT last fall had to fire one of their biologists for inventing papers. There's another case that's unfolding right now of a Norwegian cancer scientist. There have been others. And scientists typically say two things. You know, every few years, there's sort of there's one of these fraud cases, and scientists say two things. They say, well, this doesn't happen very often, and they say it for two variations on that. One, we have the peer review system. So scientists publish a paper, and other scientists are going to check it, and if there's a problem, if there's a problem, you're going to get caught. And then they say, excuse me for a minute here. And then they say, there also just aren't that many cases of this. And I think both of those are probably wrong. I can't prove it, but let me tell you sort of my perspective, having looked at this for a little bit. First of all, I think the way science works is you publish a paper, and if it's really important, then other people in the field need to replicate it because they need to take the next step. They need to repeat what you've done so they can go on to the next step. If you publish a paper that's not that important, then someone else may try it and it doesn't work and they give up, or they try it, but they try it maybe slightly differently and it doesn't work, and it typically disappears. I would argue that for most papers, they fall in the second category, where something which is something which is published and not true doesn't get caught because it's never directly challenged. It never has to be directly challenged. The other thing, and I'm sure we'll have an argument about this, the other thing is that they say, well, this is rare. This hardly ever happens. And so the first question as a journalist is, well, how do you know that? Like, well, there's hardly any cases of it. It's like, well, has there been any studies of how often this happens? No. So the NIH spends, I don't know how many billions on biology research, and there has never, ever been a good study of how often scientific fraud happens. There have been a few bad studies which suggest that it happens a lot more often than we're seeing. But these are sort of surveys which have always had some sort of methodological problem. I find it shocking that biologists, where there's clearly a problem, and I would say there's probably a problem in other fields, I just have no way of knowing, have not done a scientific experiment to find the answer. So, and I'd like to give an example of how such an experiment might be done, because someone's actually done it, and I wrote a story about this a few months ago. So one of the things that happens in biology is you publish pictures. You know, here's the cell line that I created. Here's the gel that shows that I did what I said I did. And this is part of what brought the South Koreans down, because it slowly came out that the cell lines they had created, that they published in Science, were just duplicates of other images that had appeared in other papers before. I still can't wrap my head around that, like how someone thinks they're going to get away with that in a paper like that. I mean, it's like, I was going to say like a college thing, but that's probably not right. Anyways, it just sort of, it's so lame. So you ask yourself, okay, so we live in this world now where it's incredibly easy to manipulate digital images, to copy them, change them, take out the parts you don't like. You sort of can't be on the internet without seeing this, right? Photoshop, everyone has access to Photoshop now. So here you have this clear case of someone basically doing science by Photoshop. It's a lot more efficient, a lot cheaper, I guess. So it raises the question, well, how many other scientists are doing this? And the answer, of course, would be, well, this hardly ever happens. There's only a few cases of this every year, and blah, 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 blah. So there's a journal, the Journal of Cell Biology, which is one of the top biological journals. And they have an editor there who I have a lot of respect for, Because if his journal publishes something that's wrong, that's a fraud, he takes it personally. In other words, he thinks that he has betrayed his readers and not done his job. Now, this may seem sort of unremarkable to you, but I have to say, in my conversations with journal editors in general, they have a more distant relationship with this issue than he does. He gets mad. It makes him angry that people do this. And, you know, if you talk to other editors, they'll sort of say the same things. But I don't get the sense that they really, really, really want to find all these things. Being videotaped, so now I'm in trouble. Okay. So what did he do? So he said, well, we're just going to do something simple. We can't go out to every lab and audit every experiment that we run, every experiment that we publish. That would be impossible. Which is an argument you also hear from journal editors. You know, this is built, science is built on trust. There'd be no way for us to go out, go out to BC and go through Kevin Bedell's lab and pull out all his notebooks and, talk to all his grad students and, blah, 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 blah. It would take months. So what he did is, okay, let's do something simple. We'll ask everyone to file all their stuff electronically. So all the images come to us electronically. It's a good idea anyways because it's going to be faster. And we're just going to check the images using Photoshop, just a few minutes. We'll have a production person just blow them up, make a few contrast adjustments just to make sure that no one's really done anything wrong. So he's been doing this for 3 years. And again, this is one of the top biological journals. It's not Science or Nature, but it's really, it's one of the top journals. Very well respected. And so the papers go through the peer review process, and then they end up with this production person who looks at the photos, the images. And they found that in about 1/4 of the cases, 1/4 of all the cases, the images had been changed so much that it was misleading, that the images were misleading. And in 1% of all the cases, that is 1 in every 100 paper, the images had been altered so much that it changed the entire interpretation of the experiment. In other words, the person had committed fraud. This is 1 in 100. Just think how many experiments there are, how many papers there are published in biology. How much money we spend on biological research. And it gives you a sense for the true scope of this problem. Now, I would argue that the case that the frequency of fraud is probably higher than that, at least in biology. And I would argue that in other disciplines, we have no idea. No one studied it. If I were a scientist or I were an editor at a scientific journal, I'd really want to know the answer to that question. And as a taxpayer, I definitely want to know the answer to that question. I'm not paying for fiction. I'm paying for real research to be done. So I think that there's a problem, and I think we have no idea how big it is. But I think the sort of excuses that we hear, that it's very rare, that this hardly ever happens, that people are always found out, just aren't true. Or at least they haven't been proven to be true, which should be the standard. So, I'm going to wrap up here. What does all this mean? First of all, so what does this mean about science and the truth? First of all, I would say that any paper, even a good paper, which has no problems with it, it's a good scientific paper, has an element of story to it. And by that, I mean, you read the paper, and you get a very rational, clean version of how this team had this idea and checked it, and lo and behold, they came up with this great answer. That's not typically how things work. And I'm not saying this is fraud or a problem or paper shouldn't be written this way at all. But there's a disconnect, I think, between what you read in a paper and how and how science is really done. The next thing I would say is that it's very difficult to talk about science at the frontier. And that is, a paper's published this year. What does this mean? Some of these papers will turn out to be true. Others of them will turn out not to be true. Not because of fraud necessarily, but just because, you know, that's what groping in the dark is like. Sometimes you find something that seems important, and then sometimes it collapses. And it's especially difficult to hold a sort of public policy debate over an issue when it's an issue like this at the frontier, that is stem cell research. So with stem cell research, you know, we want to know, well, how much use are embryonic stem cells going to be? Well, we don't know. We've only had them for a few years, and we don't really know how to do very much with them. We don't really understand them. We don't know where they come from. The next thing that I think is important, which is obvious, which is that science can be readily faked. So this idea of this science representing truth, I think that's the goal. I hope that's the goal, but it's not always true. The other thing, and again, I suppose this is obvious, but science does what it does. There's a lot of things that science can't do. So science can describe what happens to cells under certain circumstances, but it can't tell you what it means in a sort of philosophical sense. You know? Is this embryo a life? Science can't answer that. You know, that's a metaphysical question. But because in our society we're so used to sort of accepting the word of scientists, I think we have a tendency to give a scientist's opinion more weight. That is, this is a scientist who's saying this thing. And I often see, and this is sort of something that bothers me in the media, you see a scientist sort of saying something is true. Well, I did this experiment and this is true. Typically, if you look at the experiment, it doesn't necessarily support this broader statement. It may, that may be the best interpretation. But you can't really make a statement like that without explaining exactly what it is that you did in your experiment. Because then everyone can understand, you know, what are the big leaps of interpretation you're making. The other thing about science is that it's really, really slow. You know, people in this stem cell debate have sort of wanted to think that we're just, you know, we're poised to have all these amazing new cures. And it's just not the case. Science works very slowly. And it has to work slowly. And given all these things, you can see how it's very easy for the public to be very confused and to not understand the issue. And yet we have this problem, which is that we live in a democracy. I shouldn't say that's a problem. We live in a democracy, and people have a right to know what's happening. And in addition, the public is paying for most scientific research. So we have an obligation, we journalists, we scientists, educators, have an obligation to explain to the public what's happening as best we can. I think I'll leave it right there. So, thank you.
We're, how much time do we have, Kevin? About 20, 25 minutes. Obviously, there's quite a bit that one could either accept or take issue with. For example, the opening statement being that science is about truth. Many of us may say that no, that science is about unmasking non-truths, because there's no way that we can ever prove anything true. We can only identify those things that are not true. And so that if anything, I would argue science is about untruths, because there's no way we really have of identifying when something is true. And so throughout history, we've had difficulty distinguishing the important point you made at the end in terms of, are the facts wrong or are the inferences incorrect? And that it's pretty difficult for me to think of inferences being an issue of fraud, because that would be very difficult. But facts, yeah, you That's more empirical. You can talk about fraud if one is dealing with the facts. But let me open that up to the group then. I mean, how would you answer some of the very basic issues that relate to the relationship between science and truth, and what can we learn about stem cell research, or what can we learn about that relationship through stem cell research? Now, let me first ask Mr. Koch if, in fact, anyone has ever presented the idea of science being about untruths versus science being about truth, because, in fact, I don't think we could ever discover truth.
Well,
Newton
now I'm
was
way
wrong.
out of my depth. I mean, yeah, I don't even know how to answer that question. I think I think that's a good point in the sense that that sort of rings true with how I've seen science done. But I think that if you, at least in my discussions with scientists, they basically want to know how things work. They want to know what's happening, right? And you can argue that making the leap from that point to truth with a big T is maybe too big a leap to take. But I guess that's the shorthand I was using.
Okay. Any comments or questions? Yeah?
Well, he was talking about truth and fraud. If you make a mistake, that's allowed. If you're fraudulent, that's not allowed. But the question I'm going to ask him is that, you know, there are frauds throughout society. Every department, every aspect of it is fraud. It's fraud also in science. Science is made by people, just like this with you. What is you mentioned 1 or 2% that you. What is acceptable to you as a journalist? What percentage of science you tolerate as being fraudulent or allowed?
So how much science can be wrong? So I wouldn't give a number, but I would answer it this way. I would say that what I would want of any institution is that they're trying really, really hard to prevent it. And I think if you look, for example, in hospitals, it used to be that they didn't try really, really hard to prevent medical errors. And now a lot of them do try really, really hard to prevent medical errors. They've thought about it as an issue. You know, we make mistakes. Which situations do we make mistakes? How can we lower the times? How can we lower the incidence of problems? Air traffic control is another example where they weren't always as careful as they could be, and now they try really hard to prevent mistakes. I would say that I'm not convinced. I'm very far from being convinced that science has done everything it can to prevent fraud. And I'm very confident in making that statement on biology. Physics, I have no idea. But I guess the first baseline question would be, okay, if you're trying really hard to prevent fraud, the first question I would ask is, how often does it happen? And if you don't even know how big a problem it is, then how can you be doing everything you possibly can to prevent it? So, you know, whether it should be 1/10 of 1% or, you know, 1/100th, I don't know. But I think it should be as low as, you know, you can reasonably make it, and I don't think that we're there in science anyways. Journalism, of course, has, you know, has the same problems, and I don't think where we need to be in journalism either.
John?
I don't really know what you mean by as low as you possibly can, because detecting fraud takes time, takes resources. You could require that, you know, every paper be duplicated by 5 different sets of scientists.
Okay, so this is
That wouldn't be worth it. I would
Yep.
rather have fraud than have
Yep.
scientists.
So exactly. So you make a very important point, which I disagree with, which is that you're making an argument by extremes, which is exactly what the journal editors do. They say, look, it would be impossible for us to stop all fraud. To stop all fraud, we would have to audit every experiment. We'd have to order 3 independent replications of it. Science would grind to a halt. I agree with that. We can't do that. The question is not, can we stop all fraud, but have we thought long and hard about all the things we can reasonably do at reasonable expense to stop it? And in the case of biology, the fact that, for example, all biological journals don't, as a matter of course, take the 20 or 30 minutes it would take per paper to check to see whether or not they've been photoshopped, I find that unacceptable. What other measures could be taken? I don't know. I mean, I'm not a journal editor, but the question is, have journal editors, have scientists thought about this as a problem per se, and applied the sophisticated tools they have of, conducting experiments to find out what's happening, testing different ways of, improving the situation. And so that's what I would want.
But I think that, I couldn't agree more, but I think the phraseology is important here. You should say things like at reasonable expense or reasonable things, and not say things like to make fraud as low as we possibly can. We actually don't want to make it as low as we possibly can.
Well, you could you could have zero science and then you'd have zero fraud, right?
He's an economist now.
That was a good answer, right? Right, it's like,
5 miles an hour on the Mass Pike,
Right.
reduce traffic deaths. In
Right.
fact, as a society, we prefer traffic deaths, sad as they are.
Right.
To 5%, 5-mile-an-hour speed limit.
right, yep,
So the
absolutely.
optimal amount of almost nothing I can think of is zero.
Yeah, I don't know where optimum is, but it's not here. I guess that's what I would
Let's
say.
have some of the biologists in the audience. I know that field has been singled out. Are there any? Yes? Well, there's somebody in the back, or you go ahead. You've got the mic.
I wanted to address the obligation of scientists to tell about our research to the public because, thanks to the taxpayer, they're funding our research. And I think that that's probably one of the major problems is the jargon that we use as scientists makes it almost impossible to express our ideas to the general public, the uneducated, and things like that because just some things I jotted down, stem cell to us equals, like you said, killing an embryo, or like evolution equals a monkey man, or, cloning equals Star Wars and an army, or something like that, and that it's the hurdle that us as scientists, I think, have to address in how we have to relate our own research to the general public because we can't fight on their level. If people are saying, my religion tells me that this is wrong and, we did not evolve from a lesser species, we can't come at them and attack that argument. We have to address them on a level that maybe they'll understand, that cloning is not, or evolution is not just this, cloning is not just that, there's different things like, why did you get a vaccination for the flu 2 years in a row? That's another example that might hit closer to home.
But in communicating with the public, how would you suggest we not perpetuate fraud by intentionally misleading the public in the way that we heard described in the talk?
Well, I'm not really addressing the fraud issue, but in my opinion, zero fraud is what we need to shoot for. But in the public's eye, I think it's just a matter of communication. We have to try to communicate with people without misleading. We can't take our facts and paint a beautiful picture if that's not the case. And like you said in how scientists present papers and stuff, we say, oh well, we tried all these things and voila, this is what we have. We don't present the failures because it's not really, you can't really publish your failures, the things like that. So.
Yeah.
I just want to say one thing. He's describing a very difficult situation that at least stem cell biologists found themselves in, which is they'd hear their opponents making all these wild accusations, and they wanted to fight back. And sort of the most effective way to fight back is not necessarily by telling the truth. It's by saying, well, that's stupid, and sort of, going down to that level where you're basically, wrestling with them, right, butting heads. But I would say that, it's not my role to sort of fight the political battles, but I would say that there's actually a lot of progress that can be made on any of these debates that we're talking about, just by getting as much of the public as possible to understand the sort of basic facts. And that's sort of what my goal is not to settle the argument, but let's just agree on what actually happens, what the sort of bare facts are. Because part of what fuels these very emotional debates is misinformation. And so I think it's very powerful. It may not win arguments at the end of the day, but I think it's very powerful to at least get a common set of facts out there so that people know what these different things are. So, people know what the Danish newspaper ran, what cartoon they ran, as opposed to all the other images that are out there. That's just one example, but people get very riled up when they see something, and then when they discover the truth, they can bring the emotions down a notch and then maybe, you know, discuss it.
It's difficult with different backgrounds, though, when you have someone who won't even accept the fact that the Earth is of the age that it's at, that there wasn't a creation, you know, 4,000 or 6,000 years ago.
Right.
It's hard to lay down a common set of facts.
Let's move on to another area, right? Go ahead.
I teach ethics here, and I'm in the theology club. And I really enjoyed your lecture because I often reflect with my students that in many professional fields like law, medicine, nursing, we see that there's professional training and professional ethics. But in my becoming a professor, I never had a course on professional ethics. I think that what you are raising are not questions simply for scientific research, but for the need to have professional ethical training in the academy. I also want to add, I'm a priest, and we have the same problem in the church. So it's something I really want to applaud that you're bringing to the fore of how, as academicians, we need to try to incorporate more clearly professional standards in an ethical context. But I have a question about you as a journalist. Whenever I'm interviewed by a newspaper, no matter what I say, they're looking for another point of view after I finished. And there's something oppositional in the journalist's own research that actually I think contributes to this polarity in which people are looking more for an opposite point of view rather than for the truth. So I'm wondering if you could comment on the journalist as the corroborator or collaborator to some of the misinformation that goes out. That is that the method of the journalist, instead of sometimes pursuing the truth, even in ethical discourse, is more interested in the opposite point of view to achieve so-called balance, rather than to try to find out how well all the information has been related.
Right. Now that's an excellent question. And first of all, I mean, just addressing the point of professional ethics, I have had no training as a journalist. You know, I never took a journalism class. I didn't even work in a college newspaper. So I've had 0 days of education in journalism. All I know about the professional ethics of journalism, I gleaned from memos from the editor about the things you're not supposed to do, and just trying to think about what it is I do. But that's not the question you ask. The question you ask is, how much do journalists pursue the truth as opposed to a story? And there's a fundamental tension here, which is that it's a lot easier, it takes a lot less time to to write a story in which you basically get a realm of opinions on things. It takes a lot more time, and you have to be a lot more confident in your reporting to write a story that's trying to get at the truth. So if I have 6 hours and I have to write a story on topic X, I have to say, okay, well, who's against topic X and who's for topic X, and I have to talk to them and I have to quote them. And I mean, this is all a caricature, but I mean, this is basically what you're talking about. And this problem, which is sort of fundamental to journalism and the time constraints that journalists operate under, is, well, first of all, let me defend the practice and then go on. So the meager defense of the practice is that at least it gets the reporter talking to people with different opinions. So that's better than not talking to people with different opinions. So that's my lame defense of it. So the goal, however, of a good story would be to try to get at the truth. And I think one area where we really see this problem is in global warming, which is that, or in any topic that's really complicated. I think stem cell research is like that as well, where it's going to take a long time, it's going to take a reporter a long time to get up to speed and a long time on any particular story to understand what really, are we fairly confident of, and what do we not know. So for someone who doesn't know a lot about climate change, you'll get a story saying, okay, scientists found that it's warmer this year than it's been in the last 1,200 years. And you talk to one guy who says, no, that doesn't mean anything. It goes up and down. You talk to another guy who says, yes, the ice caps are melting. New York's going to be underwater in 100 years, and then you're safe, right? So what you really want the journalists to do, and what they should do, given enough time and enough resources from their newspaper, is to go deep enough into the topic so they know whether or not they have to quote one or both of those people. So this is a really unsatisfying answer, I'm afraid. But there are reporters and there are institutions, there are newspapers that give the reporters the time to try to get at the truth. And I hope that's what I did in my stem cell stories. I mean, I'd be interested if you read them, where I tried to get at the underlying truths. And there are journalists who work. I'm Andrew Revkin at the New York Times on global warming. There are journalists who really try hard to really get at the truth and then write the story. But it's a lot more time consuming. And people aren't paying for newspapers like they used to. So, I mean, someone has to pay my salary. Someone has to pay for me to spend an entire year just looking at stem cell research while the rest of science goes completely or almost completely ignored. So, I mean, I thank the Globe for letting me do that. So that's a sort of meandering answer to your question.
Garrett, isn't there a fundamental difference between trying to uncover the accuracy or inaccuracy of an inference in terms of the way facts are interpreted versus the fraudulent production of those facts?
Yeah, so those are completely different, and I've sort of...
So which are we dealing with here? I mean, truth to me has to deal with the inferences you draw from those facts versus the fraudulent production of them. So you doctor up the picture.
Right.
That
So
to me is a fraudulent production of a fact.
Right,
Or-
so those are completely separate situations, but I think both of them fall under the general rubric of the public being misled about, you know, whatever. I mean, it's what he was asking about is situations where people have, you know, there's a scientific study and people are interpreting it to make their political point. And then we have the
But is that fraud, is what I'm asking?
No, I don't think that's fraud at all. I think that that's people having their political opinion. And what I was trying to say is that it takes a lot of forceful journalism to reduce the amount of sort of, you know, people just having their random opinions.
But the very example that you used in the beginning of your presentation was of two sides on the stem cell debate, how that in their ethical opinions, marshaled evidence that really wasn't reliable evidence.
Right.
And it was reported by the press.
Right.
So there's a
Over and
certain
over
way
again.
that the press is not unlike nature publishing a fraudulent article. It's
Right.
a certain way that they contribute to the very misinformation that we have.
Because it's difficult. I mean, that's the answer. I mean, I think that it took me a month to write a story about this woman struggling with this issue. And it would take an hour to call someone who thinks that this shouldn't happen and call someone who thinks this should happen and to quote them. I mean, that's just the reality.
Mike?
Well, it's actually a question for the biologists in the audience, or a question to you, this editor at Cell Biology you're conversing with. There's the 1% that are pretty clear is fraud, and there's this other 25% of data that's fudged or something. And that's not fraud, or is that the top 25% of the papers or the bottom 25%?
No, so that's 25% where someone has you know, increased the contrast on an image so that it looks better, but it doesn't change the actual data.
So the question to the biologist here, and anybody else that might have done, I'm guessing some people in this room have done that
No,
before,
absolutely.
and-
If you have a gel image, I mean, I think that the way it's been explained to me, you just have to run them again and again, and even when you take a photo, you can sort of adjust how you're taking the image. Anyways, you're asking the biologist. I shouldn't answer this
Yeah, I just
question.
wanted to do this.
So the question of the biologist
This
is,
is a common thing. Probably
what,
not-
to enhance or to fraudulently alter an image? I thought you were asking for a confessional, Mike.
They can confess that as well. I'm guessing that changing the contrast is a common occurrence.
And, yeah.
Yes.
Your name, please?
You have the data acquisition device.
It's biologist.
gives you a digital image. I'm in the biology department. And you get you adjust the contrast so you can see your bands. But if you go in there with the smudge tool and take out a band that you don't want to be there, that's fraud.
Right. So there's.
How you do it?
Another biologist.
So the 25%, just to quickly answer that, is when you're doing that just so that you can see the bands, and then maybe you push it a little bit further, and some of the incidental smudges may be falling out. No one thinks that that's actual data. So the editor looks at this and says, okay, they've pushed the contrast that much, but it doesn't affect the interpretation of the experiment. They've just gone too far in cleaning it up. I mean, where those judgment lines fall, it's up to the editor. I don't know how they would decide. Anyways, go ahead, sorry.
Oh, so, I just wanted to comment a little bit about, well, a couple of comments. So So in the biology department, at least, and I think as a requirement, one of the requirements of the NIH is we run a weekly or even weekly series for our graduate students called Responsible Conduct of Research. So we work on ethical training of our students in very detailed series of seminars. And that was a comment. I wanted to speak to kind of the larger thing about the pressures on.
Can you stand so to make sure
Oh,
people can hear
sorry.
you?
The pressures on cutting edge science by the political forces. So I was reading in the Science that just came out yesterday, actually, there are a couple of letters to the editor commenting on Huang's story. And one of them was saying, well, it's a good thing Science magazine was the first to publish this retraction, because they're the ones that made the big deal about the first article. And they pointed out that that first article was actually, they were able to clone stem cells from a lot of other animals, but they were saying it was human cloned stem cells. So actually the technology wasn't that new. It was just that it was human. But I think there are political pressures on science. So when we're at this point where we know in our hearts that there's going to be some benefit from stem cell research, but there are political pressures from our current administration to not fund this. So if there's any glimmer of keeping this alive, keeping funding going into this, there's too much pressure on a journal like Science to publish something that maybe it shouldn't have gotten published for what it
Right.
was. So I'm trying to point out the political aspect of this, because you're pointing out about your tax dollars, and your tax dollars are also supporting our current administration. So,
Yeah, some question over here.
Yeah, sure. My name's Ryan. I'm a senior and I'm a biology major. And kind of in that same vein, what connection to fraud do you see having to do with sources of funding, be it from a current, government administration or a political group, or whatever that's opposed to certain research? I was wondering if you had thought about that in factoring in that 1%. Who paid for that research?
Right. So that
scientists know where their paychecks come from. So.
Right. So that 1% figure, I think those were typically just government NIH grants. But the role of money in science is another whole topic that I know less about, but which is a huge problem. And in fact, the New England Journal of Medicine, I can't remember, it was a few months ago, they retracted a paper saying that I believe it was Merck, is Merck the Vioxx one? I can't remember. Anyways, the company that made this drug had removed some of the patients who died of heart attacks, or it was something like that. So they retracted the paper. And I think it's pretty clear, and journal editors are very concerned about this problem of industry-funded research sort of getting the, seal of approval from the journal, though the industry may be pressuring the scientists to present it a certain way or even suppressing information. And I think anyone who's really looked at that thinks it's a pretty serious problem. It's not something I personally have done reporting on, though.
So what is the most serious problem then, Gareth? The fact that scientists then stray from their role in the development of facts to the development of inferences for political or other purposes, or policymakers using those for those purposes. Is that a bigger issue for fraud when that's done to intentionally mislead versus the sort of smudges, erasures that people do to fraudulently develop the facts? I mean, which is the bigger problem, or in your mind, are they both equally bad and equally huge in prevalence?
I would say that the problem is that we have no idea how big any of those problems are.
Either one?
I just don't know. I mean, if I had to guess, just based on no data, what the biggest problem in science is right now, the most nefarious problem, I would guess that it's industry money suppressing information that has direct health consequences for us. That's what I would guess is the most serious issue. But I've done no reporting on it. That's just what my instinct would tell me. But for a lot of those, those variations that you raise, I mean, it's just kind of hard to know without more information about what.
We have time for about one or two more questions. In the back, yeah? Tony?
In the interest of reasoned debate, I'd like to ask a favor. And that is this. When we discuss this topic, I'd like to ask you and other people to really make the effort to differentiate between science that is incorrect and science that is fraudulent. And I don't think you did that well enough, at least in the early part of your talk. Basically, on available reagents, current techniques, current paradigms, just a snapshot. I mean, if you look at all the textbooks, there are 20 amino acids. Now we know that there are 22. It's not because the textbook is lying or fraudulent, it's because that's the state of the science, and that's how science moves forward. So I think, at least in the debate, we need to say, if you open up a journal, X amount is wrong. It could be wrong, doesn't mean it's fraudulent.
Right, so I was focusing, maybe I should have been more clear in my preface. I was focusing on the really negative aspect of this, which is, intentional fraud and also the ways that people spin information. I think I sort of just glancingly referred to the problem of frontier science, where some of it turns out to be right or wrong, just not through any fault of the scientists, but it's a good point.
We'll give Tom the last word.
Yeah, well,
You might want to stand, Tom, because it's hard to hear.
I think it comes
Another
across
biologist.
as if we allow a lot of, or turn our head to a different direction when fraud goes on in the sciences. I don't think that's the case at all. I mean, as journal editors and reviewers of papers, we're always trying to find flaws and inconsistencies to give the paper a rejection, basically. And you have to also realize it's not journalists that are identifying these situations, it's the scientists themselves. So science does police itself. It's not a perfect police. But in fact, they're a very skeptical group, basically. They don't believe most of the things that intrinsically, there must be something wrong with everything that everybody does. And this gives you the reason why you can reject a grant or a paper. So obviously what does get through is something that, and then it makes a big case. We have the patchwork mouse. We have a history of these kinds of events. It's just that they make a big splash. This is something that the media can get a hold of and make a big, but by and large, this is not a perfect, as Tony said, this is certainly not perfect, but on the other hand, the system does police itself, and for the good of mankind, the advances that do come out are certainly of enormous significance to our species and to the society as a whole. I mean, these are the big advances. Now, we have to accept every field has this kind of a problem, but I think you also have to look at the good to mankind that this adventure does bring.
Right. So I should be clear. I mean, I completely agree with you that I'm not against biological research by any means. Nor do I think that scientists are gullible, or that if a typical scientist sees something that's fraud, that they'll look the other way. The point I was trying to make is that I don't believe that biologists as a group, or scientists as a group, have looked at this problem in a systematic way and tried to come up with, and tried to do everything that they can to reduce the incidence of it. That's not to say that they're not doing anything. That's not to say that most biology is wrong. But I have to say that when one of the top biology journals does this test, this simple test, and discovers that 1% of the papers are fraudulent, I find that really alarming. And science now is going to start doing that test. And so my point is not that we shouldn't be doing biology, or that we haven't benefited enormously from biology, but that I think that more has to be done to take the issue of fraud seriously, even though it makes people uncomfortable.
Thank you very much. I think that the take-home message for me is that even in fields where, in fact, we spend most of our time trying to unmask untruths, that, in fact, we can still do, as I think Gareth has pointed out, a much better job at looking at another variety of untruth that perhaps we haven't paid sufficient attention to, which is intentional fraud. And that's the great irony in this, that, in fact, I think of any of the professions, science, maybe the law profession, are the two that are most engaged in trying to unmask untruth, and yet that we haven't done perhaps as good a job as we had. Thank you very much.